So as you all know, 2017 is a year of climate change and health, and we really are working towards building a movement where this isn't a discussion on whether climate change is happening and whether it's impacting our health, but really that we are talking about it holistically, looking at policies, looking at practices that are at the national, state, local, and personal levels. So you all know all the challenges climate change pose on health. And the one thing I love to say is that climate change is blind. It's blind to our race, our geography, our age, our income. Everyone in their lifetime is going to be impacted by climate change. What isn't fair, what isn't equal is how quickly some communities can bounce back from those climate effects. But really low-income communities and communities of colors are disproportionately impacted by climate effects, and we really are hoping to work towards climate solutions for all. As you see here on this chart, climate change impacts are realized, but they're very low on the priority scale. And that's what we want to do here, is really want to elevate climate change impacts on health as an issue, as a national issue, as a federal issue, that it's not polarized, but it's a commonplace, it's comfortable to talk about. And then even steeped below this climate change topic, we really are facing even more challenges with recognizing the mental and psychosocial impacts of climate change, because they're not often talked about. So with the ERA, there's two main goals. The first is to raise awareness, to bridge the connection between climate change and health, that it is happening. It's not an enviro issue. It's an environment, it's a public health issue. And to also mobilize leaders who are ready to take action, to take the next step, what they could do in their communities, in their homes, in their organizations to improve climate solutions. So this is how you can get involved. Every month we have a theme. Obviously June is mental wellness, and we really hope that you guys can get involved either at the individual level or the organizational level. We really want to meet you where you are, and you can join at any level of partnership, from all the way from tweeting about this workshop to buying a hybrid car or committing to a telework policy from your organization. There's lots of benefits to joining the Year of Climate Change and Health, including building a network, making sure you get the right connections. There's so much
confidence in our institutions. When the place you call home is burned down, blown away, or flooded, when you lose your possessions, maybe your pets, your livelihood, see injuries, illness, and death, the mix of fear, anger, sorrow, and trauma can easily send us to a breaking point. Mental health professionals are seeing a full range of psychiatric disorders emerge in these situations: major depression, anxiety, PTSD, a rise in drug and alcohol abuse as people attempt to cope. Family stress leads to domestic violence, mostly against women. It includes child abuse. Some of us are lucky enough to be at a distance from the world's ongoing extreme weather events, but we're not potted plants sitting here. What scars are forming in us, seeing others drowned, burned, flooded, starved? Drought from persistent high temperatures are driving up confidence in our institutions. When the place you call home is burned down, blown away, or flooded, when you lose your possessions, maybe your pets, your livelihood, see injuries, illness, and death, the mix of fear, anger, sorrow, and trauma can easily send us to a breaking point. Drought from persistent high temperatures are driving up suicides among farmers in India, rural Australia, South Africa, and leading to rationing and water wars in the US. With persistent high temperature and the ever-expanding desert it creates, the Middle East, it is predicted, may well be uninhabitable by the end of the century. Sea level rise. Tens of millions of Americans live on the coastline. Without a sharp reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, Jim Hansen says, global sea level is likely to increase 10 to 13 feet in as few as 50 years. Parts of our coastal cities will still be sticking above the water, but you couldn't live there. Small islands will be swallowed up. Air pollution is primarily the result of burning fossil fuels. Higher temperatures speed up the chemical reactions that form it. In addition to the links to asthma, cancers, lung, ovarian, liver, respiratory illnesses, heart disease, changes in DNA that narrow coronary arteries and trigger heart attacks, atrial fibrillation, lifelong decreased lung volume in children, obesity, diabetes, spiking rates of autism and autoimmune disorders, polluted air is also a cause of inflammation of brain tissue. Ultrafine particulate matter, that's less than 1 micron, not the 2.5 you're thinking of, crosses directly into the brain from the nose when we breathe, causing inflammatory processes that are linked to dementia, Parkinson's, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Multiple lines of evidence support the role of neuroinflammation in classic psychiatric illness, major depressive disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorders. How much ultrafine particulate matter is in the air? Regulations to measure it do not exist. Yet ultrafine particulate matter makes up the bulk of the particles in the air and is taken to be much more hazardous to our health. Emergency room visits for anxiety and suicide threats are significantly higher on days with poor air quality. The American Psychological Association reported children exposed to small particles of chemicals in the air were more likely to have symptoms of anxiety or depression. We know that even low levels of pollution in Sweden, primarily from traffic, are associated with an increased risk of mental illness in children. The researcher who led the study said, "I would be worried myself if I lived in an area with high air pollution." Higher concentrations of CO2 alone impair cognition. Exposing workers to increasing levels of CO2 has significant impact on their cognitive functioning. The testing at indoor concentrations to which Americans are already frequently exposed shows the most serious decline in our ability to think strategically, to use information, and respond to a crisis. Not everything that counts can be counted. It is the inchoate, insidious, complex, and unconscious psychological states driven by climate trauma, not lending themselves to studies and precise numbers, that are the most profoundly damaging and drive systemic emotional conditions society will find difficult to treat and surmount. When it comes to the reach of emotional pain, as poet John Donne said, "No man is an island." The waves of injury from climate trauma and frustration from inaction are already reverberating across families, the workplace, our communities. Communally taking a toll on the national mood. Repercussions from stressed out national mood affects our economy, our politics, our relations with other countries. It shapes our culture and increasingly affects how we treat each other. Nations are like families. After 25 years in practice, I can aver that children who grow up feeling they were neglected can be deeply damaged. The belief that they have been cheated and mistreated can last a lifetime and leave them feeling resentful, the sense of abandonment interfering with their sense of commitment, fostering a defeatist attitude, making them sometimes unwilling to take initiative themselves. Future generations will know that they were neglected if proper action on climate is not taken. It begs the question, will they be different? And I can see this one coming, a climate crisis victimization syndrome, where instead of making every effort to rise above the psychological pain of the climate crisis, everything is instead blamed on it, stifling personal growth. Intentional versus accidental harm. When disasters are no longer experienced solely as acts of God or nature, but derived from the behavior of humans, it is much tougher on us, because what happens from intentional negligence is harder to put behind us than what happens accidentally. The rise of an anxious world. We can be anxious and not know why. We can be anxious and not know it. Sometimes anxiety is manifested as anger or another emotion or state that doesn't even suggest the root cause. We can be anxious and give it the wrong name, often if the real source is especially upsetting. We don't always recognize the psychological toll that anxiety is taking on us. Climate change evokes a profound sense of anxiety from feelings of powerlessness. People typically try to repress, that is, make unconscious what makes us feel powerless. Most of us can accept knowing that we are worried about climate and don't repress it entirely because we can accept that it is natural to feel vulnerable. Instead of accepting the fear that comes from feeling vulnerable, deniers tend to experience the fear as emasculating. For a variety of reasons, these men especially I'm talking about, are trying to offset the fear that deep down inside only girly men are afraid. Their outward display, denial, is overcompensation. A therapeutic approach to these people, generally to help deniers, would be to address the personal insecurities that stand in the way of accepting reality. More can be said about this, I'm sure, as you can imagine. Much of the violence in the world can be explained by unaddressed anxiety emanating from the feeling of powerlessness. Whether we know it or not, whether we accept it or not, there isn't the slightest shred of a doubt in my mind that we are already full of anxiety about climate change, and that it is driving us towards an increasingly stressed out world. Will we be in a growing state of fear from diminished productivity, distrust of each other, conflict between haves and have-nots, callousness, numbness in our response to suffering, compassion fatigue, an alienated citizenry? Will we have the opportunity to innovate or work our way out of this? Ecosystems disrupted. You can't have healthy individuals on a sick planet. Biodiversity lost, both animals and plants. In the last 50 years, wildlife, it has been estimated, has declined by 40%. Professionals specializing in the effects of climate on animals or habitat are themselves no strangers to trauma. Experts cite the loss of career-long passions, the coral reef that has been destroyed by bleaching, the frog species believed to be extinct. In our fight for the climate, it has been said that we should think of people, not polar bears, a legitimate reminder that privileged groups overlook the environmental justices affecting people in places where socioeconomic challenges impede the ability to be heard. But animals are central to our existence. We know that our special bond with pets has enormous psychological benefits, lowering anxiety, sensitivity to pain, aggression, improving learning, empathy, social confidence, and that this bond lowers blood pressure and heart rate and boosts the immune system. One biological messenger is likely oxytocin, the human bonding hormone associated with fostering trust and altruism. Studies show the green space in which wild animals live provides the same physical and psychological benefits that having pets does. After spending time in nature, we are more generous. Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, is a movement in Japan dedicated to providing city dwellers with the healing effects of green space. We are risking profound psychological damage as we stray from the ecosystems we were evolved to share with other species. It may be 30%, but up to 50% of species are headed towards extinction by mid-century. Some of humanity's most troubling health problems could become treatable by studying our animal relatives. Below are examples of animals that carry a treasure trove of potentially life-saving information and are at risk specifically or are from a class at risk. From the work of Nobel laureate Erik Shivan with Ari Bernstein, the African clawed frog, he produces antimicrobials that make them immune to common human infections. This could be the key that unlocks a whole new class of antibiotics, not bad in an era where bacteria are increasingly becoming resistant. Dog sharks, they secrete squalamines that can cut off the blood supply to ovarian and lung cancers, and maybe other cancers. Cone snails secrete substances that have 1,000 times the pain-killing capacity of morphine and are already being used in the spinal fluid of people with intractable pain. They are threatened by coral reef die-offs. Salamanders cut off a limb and they grow a new one. We know this capacity is hidden somewhere in our DNA, but where? Polar bears, they hibernate and lose calcium. think treating osteoporosis. When they are back on their feet, calcium goes right back on their bones. How does that work? By the way, it doesn't happen in captivity. It has become a race against time to get the data before some of these species are lost. Our food supply at risk. Climate change leads to food insecurity by reducing the amount and quality of the food we can produce. Every 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature results in an average 10% decline in food and agricultural output. The price of food goes up. In parts of the world where as much as 80% of income goes for food, shortages and higher prices upend communities with fighting, rationing, and the stress of hunger. High levels, oops, there was a slide missing, that's all right. High levels of CO2 lower nutrients such as iron, zinc, and protein in exactly the crops the world's poor mostly depend on: rice, wheat, maize, and soybeans. Food insecurity destabilizes governments, damages our health, and harms our communities. The masses of refugees in the throes of the worst drought in 900 years were on the road in Syria looking for food in places that didn't want them and couldn't help them, tripping the geopolitical wire that brought us the catastrophe we see today. Oceans. High levels of CO2 dissolve into our oceans, causing acidification, impeding the growth of key species of the food web, including the ocean's nurseries, coral reefs. More than 1 billion people rely on food from the ocean as the primary source of protein. Bacteria from algal blooms associated with climate change produces a neurotoxin, BMAA, beta-methylamino L-alanine, that enters our food chain. The brain tissue of humans exposed to this neurotoxin shows some of the same changes that are seen in Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's. BMAA is found in commercially marketed seafood. Threats to world order. Though the result of multiple forces, climate change is today a root cause of the explosion of refugees looking for safety. Destabilized regions. As resources become scarcer, the competition for them becomes fiercer. Fragile nations can fail. In Europe, a sharp turn to the right politically has occurred. I used to say, we shall see here in America. Now we have our answer. In the US, with 5% of the world's population, we have put up 25% of the world's greenhouse gases. Jihadists are already using global warming as a rallying cry against us. We may be in denial, but they are not. Papers swept up during the storm of Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad and earlier letters show his focus on America's role in causing climate change. And I quote, "You have destroyed nature with your industrial waste and gases more than any other nation in history." These are tough words to hear from a fiend with so much blood on his hands, but how do we answer this? Will we become pariahs? As a former CIA profiler, I fear for our democratic way of life. The rise of authoritarian government, because in times of peril and scarcity, people turn to what they perceive as strong leaders to protect them. They are willing to give up their freedoms in exchange for perceived security. Heaven help us from the tyrants this can unleash. The experiences of citizens stranded at the Superdome in New Orleans in the days after Katrina are an example of how quickly our systems can be overwhelmed and our faith in them turned upside down. Faith in a functional government is the sine qua non of stable society. Special populations at risk are children, the elderly, the sick, the disabled, the mentally ill, the poor, those living in the bullseye of disaster-prone areas along coastlines and rivers, tornado alleys, inner cities with the heat island effect, first responders, climate Cassandras who suffer from pre-traumatic stress disorder in the grip of images of future disasters they can't put out of their minds. In the first published climate change delusion, a 17-year-old Australian boy had to be hospitalized for refusing to drink water, believing it would cause millions in his drought-ridden country to die of thirst. The Melbourne Children's Hospital who treated him told me he has a clinic full of children with climate anxieties. Transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is carried by an off-on switch. The activation of a human gene for stress in the face of trauma can be passed on to succeeding generations compounding the toll. Now some taboo issues. Aggression. When we put people in harm's way, there is a name for it. It's called aggression. Inaction on climate is a display of aggression towards future generations. What we eat. Transitioning to a low-carbon plant-based diet is the only way to save the world from hunger, fuel shortages, and climate change, according to the United Nations Environmental Program, which has declared essential a global shift towards a plant-based diet. Traveling by air, acknowledging the tremendous carbon costs of airline travel, climate communications specialist George Marshall points out we would have to save nearly 800,000 plastic bags to offset a one-way trip from Australia to the UK. Environmental grief. A new term has been coined, solastalgia, to describe the pain of seeing lands that once gave the treasured sense of home now lost or irreparably damaged. Should I have a baby is a question increasingly being asked by young people, worried about the carbon costs of bringing another person into the world. A doctoral student in anthropology at Stanford and one of his friends whom I'm in contact with have been discussing rational suicide in the face of climate and carbon impacts. And the ultimate psychosocial impact is we register these warnings and ponder the overwhelming beauty and complexity of nature, inspiring us with awe and wonder. What finally is the cost of all of this to our souls? In my years as a psychiatrist, I have seen children suffer physically and emotionally at the hands of adults. As we look over recent events in our nation, when we consider how much physical and emotional suffering will come to our children, how can inaction on climate be interpreted as anything other than child abuse? Entitlement. Though well-off members of society rail at financial entitlements given to those on the lower end of the socioeconomic totem pole, the entitlement that is the most unjust is the one rarely mentioned, leading a high-carbon lifestyle. 10% of the world's richest emit 50% of the world's greenhouse gases. Norwegian sociologist Stein Ringen warned in 2014 that the UK and the US were in trouble because of multiple stressors, the gap between the haves and the have-nots, corruption, money for political contributions in exchange for policy votes, and complacency. When the lights went out in Athens, Ringen warned, it was 2,000 years before constitutional democracy again emerged. Democracy is not a default form of government. Social justice is never guaranteed. As climate trauma exacerbates these conditions, we must steel ourselves with resolve and resilience, because in this critical moment in the history of civilization, we are the ones who are here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for that presentation. And we're now going to move into a focus on what can we do about this. I want to give a little bit of background to that might repeat a little bit of what Lisa talked about, but mostly we're going to focus on what can we do about this. And let me say that, let's see, how do we get back? There we go. I coordinate the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. We call it the ITRC for short, because it's hard to get all that out. And we specifically called it transformational resilience because is based on what Lisa just told you and what I'll talk about just briefly, and what I think all of you know and those of you watching know, is that with climate change growing, temperatures rising, global temperatures rising, and the impacts of climate change are going to grow no matter what we do to some extent, we don't want to just bounce back to where we are today. We actually want to, that's a minimum. We want to actually use the adversities of climate change as catalysts to learn and grow and increase well-being, including our own well-being, the well-being of others, and the well-being or the condition of the environment and climate. So that's what why we came up with the name Transformational Resilience. And what I'm going to share with you is the work of a team of 12 people, mostly psychologist and resiliency building specialist, trauma treatment specialist that we worked with for a couple of years, putting together a model for how we can get out front of these issues. And what, again, as I said in my introduction, really want to emphasize trying to launch a preventative movement around the country in every organization and in every community to begin to build personal and psychosocial spiritual resilience. And we think that has tremendous potential. It's already happening in many communities. They don't call it the same words, and you don't have to call it the same thing. Many of them are not explicitly focused on climate change. They're focused on adverse childhood experiences and other kinds of it, but the skills that they're teaching, the focus, the policies they're adopting are easily transferable by expanding what we're doing to include these issues. So let's dive into this a little bit. But to do that, what I'd like each of you to do for just a second, those of you here in the audience and those of you even watching, can you bring to mind one image, one resource that when you think about it, it brings you a great deal of calming, peace, or joy? Just bring to mind something like that. It can be an external resource. Maybe it's being at a certain place that when you think about yourself being there by a lake or in a field or in your garden, it really brings you a sense of peace or joy. Or it could be an external resource like an animal that I had an old 18-pound kitty cat named Beluga. And the image of holding Beluga in my arm always made me, relaxed me and calmed me a little bit. So it could be an internal resource or an external resource. An internal resource can also be a religious belief or an image of somebody, a spiritual guide, or it could be an imaginary belief. It could be a fantasy person from a magazine or something. Bring to mind one or two resources that help you feel calm and peaceful and a sense of joy. And then if you would, we're just going to do this very briefly. Could you turn to someone else near you and just share your name and what that resource is? What resource came to mind when you thought about that? Just do this for a brief second. Just take 10 seconds more. Okay, if we come back to the room. That wasn't a lot of time, but I see a lot of people laughing. What was that like? Anybody willing to share what happened just by sharing your resource with somebody, identifying it and sharing it? Anybody willing to, did anybody see any change or feel any changes in your body, in your breathing, in your heartbeat or anything? Anybody willing to share anything? How about those of you who laughed a little bit when you were doing it? Natasha, anything you were willing to share?
Just thinking about it, kind of took me to a place.
Good, thank you. It eased you, she said. It took you to that place, right? Anybody else? This is a very simple skill called resourcing, developed by Elaine Miller-Karras, who directs the Trauma Resource Institute. She's one of our core members. They're out in Claremont, California. And it's an example of a simple self-administered skills we can teach or that can be taught to adults and children alike all over the US to help them calm their body, emotions, and thoughts when they're feeling distress. And it's one of a big suite of skills, and we just did it very briefly. These skills, and we'll go into a number of them, are dose-based, meaning the more you practice them and more people have a chance to practice them, the more effect they have and easier they are to bring to mind whenever they're needed. Go ahead real quick.
Sorry, yeah, I thought of like the babbling brooks, but while it made me feel calm, I also felt sad because of thinking, well, will climate change and drought take away that resource for some people? So I kind of actually felt conflicted even trying to think of the thing that makes me calm.
Thank you for sharing that. So there was a conflict that arose because you put climate change, the impacts of climate change, together with those feelings of calmness. We'll get into that in a second, how to deal with that. But let me just say that what we're trying to do is help people pay attention to pleasant sensations in the body. What we're naturally drawn to is unpleasant sensations, and we'll get right into that in a second. So when something like that comes up again, try to find a pleasant sensation to go back to. And we'll explain what that is, why that is, and the power of that. But again, what we're doing really briefly there is teaching people the psychobiology of trauma and stress. How does trauma and stress affect us? And that's the first step in really building personal and psychosocial spiritual resilience around the US. And again, I think we should launch a movement where the ITRC is urging everyone to think about really engaging in a national movement to do this. So let me just dive into this a little bit. As we all know, and as Lisa's just described, trauma and toxic stress are already at epidemic levels today. We have all sorts of issues that most people in the communities and societies in the past didn't deal with. And now to this, we have to add, on top of those other traumas and stresses, the disasters and the toxic stresses of climate change. And by toxic stresses, for those who don't know, what we mean by that is persistent and overwhelming. Some stress is good for us. That's how we improve. That's how we learn. It's when it's just overwhelming and it never goes away. So we call it toxic. And it includes from a climate perspective, heat waves, storms, sea level rise, wildfires, and a whole lot of stuff we haven't even thought about, really. We can't really figure out. And so the outcome, again, as Lisa said, is of those acute traumas, the big weather events, the floods, fires, etc. There are these kinds of traumatic events for people, these traumatic stresses. You can lose your property or your valuables, lose your place of work, your job, personal injury, physical damage to your community, and what we call black swan events, things that we just couldn't predict, that are just going to happen. And just as importantly, and I think this is really important to think about, there are a whole lot of these chronic toxic stresses. We've mostly thought of the acute disasters, the traumatic events when we think about climate change, but the chronic toxic stresses are just as important. And it's anxiety, as Lisa was talking about what about our children's future, or dealing with long-term water, food and resource shortages, or economic disruptions, or new illnesses and diseases, family disruption, forced migration if you're living near the coast or in an area where food and water is no longer available, the disruption of your social support networks, etc. All of those things, especially as you look around the world where climate change is playing out the hardest, earliest, we're seeing those already. And we're increasingly seeing them play out here. As temperature rise, what I think the most important thing is, right now what we think of as from climate change is it's mostly a one-time event, a big extreme weather event, a superstorm Sandy, if you will, and then there's a lot of time for recovery after that. But as temperatures rise close to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, or 2 degrees Celsius or more, the impacts are not likely to be one-time events followed by long periods of time for recovery. It's going to be a combination of disasters, chronic stresses, and other sorts of things, meaning less time for recovery. And when those kind of situations occur, and as Lisa just said, when people do not have sufficient knowledge about what's happening and how they're responding, when they don't have skills to deal with it, and when they don't have a community support system, they can easily Many, not all, end up harming themselves in some way. We'll talk about that in a second. Or they can turn their angst on others and harm others. Or they can harm the natural environment and climate and make things worse. And we're seeing all of those already play out. So why are these reactions occurring? What's this about? And this is a very simplistic description of the psychobiology of trauma and stress. It's more complicated than this. I always joke that this is not really even the psychobiology of climate stress 101, it's 1, okay? So, but in the lower part of our brain, humans have something called the amygdala. And you could call this the fear and anxiety center. It is always searching around in the environment unconsciously to us, searching for a potential threat or risk to us. 10,000 years ago, the threat mostly was a predator that might eat us. Today, it could be a threat to our self-esteem, the loss of a job, a speeding car coming at us, lots of different threats. And when our brain senses a threat, it automatically releases neurochemicals into our bloodstream to prepare us for that threat, to deal with that threat, and puts us in a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Freeze when it's overwhelming. And I always like to say it works like a smoke detector. It's always on, and it's better to be wrong than miss one, right? Because that might be the end. This is a very good thing. It's not a bad thing. Our amygdala is why humans are now the dominant species on Earth. It's a really good thing, but it can keep us dysregulated. It can really put us into a situation where we're always stressed. On the other hand, humans have something called the prefrontal cortex. You could call it the executive center, frontal cortex, and it can regulate, but it cannot control the fear and anxiety center. And it does that by choosing whether to respond with cognition, or with reacting to emotions, with emotions. So it goes, no, wait a second, is this a threat I've sensed before? Oh, I jump at this. Every time I hear a noise, I jump at this. I don't know, I don't need to respond in that way. But so I'm not going to respond, or, yo, this one's important to really respond to. And this is what we're seeing. This is what drives these reactions that we're seeing where people harm themselves, harm others, or harm the natural environment. So how does this play out? So how many of you get headaches when you're stressed? Anybody? Okay. There's the headache signal. How many of you get neck aches? Anybody get neck aches? A couple people. How many have your shoulders hurt? Okay. Stomach aches? You? Chest aches? How about your joints, knees? Yeah. So this is all of us, right? We all experience it in some way. What's going on? What is this about? This is the natural human reaction. I've got to point this the right way. We're having this reaction to neurochemicals, mostly cortisol and adrenaline, being released into our bloodstream because we think something's happening that we just can't deal with, or that feels overwhelming, a little bit stressful. And we're having physical reactions, blood pressure, pulse rate. Some of us have difficult breathing, headaches, stomach aches, but we're also having a mental reaction. Our mind starts to race, and we're often not aware of either of this. Often we're worried about, is this the worst thing that could ever happen to me in the future? Or was this something like happened to me when I was 10 years old or 2 years ago, whatever? And our mind just keeps racing there. And that's why the executive center brain often can't control that dysregulation because it doesn't get a handle on that mind racing. Now, most of the time, most of us experience these kind of reactions. We all do. It's perfectly natural. And we get ourselves out of it. It might take 10 minutes, might take an hour, maybe it's 2 days, but we can. But if it's overwhelming or persistent, we humans adopt what you could call self-destructive coping patterns. We dissociate, deny, and therefore reenact. Dissociate means we sort of disconnect from it. We don't really grasp what's going on, or we deny it, and therefore we repeat the same patterns that caused the problem in the first place, reenactment. We use illegal or legal drugs, we overeat, we drink too much alcohol, We become hypervigilant, or we avoid danger. We often mindlessly consume stuff and hurt the environment, etc. All of which leads to less ability to cope, solve problems, and increase our well-being. Almost all of us experience that at some point in our lives. And we're able to get ourselves out of it. You know, we had a really bad week at work. We go home and we drink too much alcohol for 2 or 3 nights, and then we're able to get ourselves out of it. If that continues, however, and we can't, we often end up with personal breakdown. We have physical health problems, lots of cancers and heart diseases and others, especially people in public health. You know that these are related to this kind of reaction. Psycho-emotional problems, spiritual problems, loss of hope, hopelessness, helplessness emerges. That's why we call these psychosocial spiritual impacts. Cognitive problems, we start forgetting things. Behavioral problems, we can become aggressive or withdraw. All again, leave us with less ability to cope and problem solve. Now again, most of the time, many of us are able to experience this kind of thing and get ourselves out of that too. We have a physical health problem, we realize, oh, I better eat better, get more exercise, reduce my stress level, etc. But if we don't, and if many people experience this kind of pattern, you can get trauma-organized groups and organizations. And what this means is the group, the organization, begins to adopt formal or informal mechanisms to protect it from the perception of a threat. But in doing that, actually further stress and traumatize employees, clients, stakeholders, people around it, etc. Many people in the public health arena actually work in organizations that were trauma organized because they're overstressed. That's where this work actually came out of initially, in fact. The mental health, public health field, where because of lack of staffing, a lack of funding, overwork, etc., they actually adopted practices that led them to be trauma organized. And if many individuals and many groups of all kinds feel this way, and experience this kind of thing, you get trauma-organized communities and societies where you get a lot of us versus them, fear and hatred and extremism, racism and systemic oppressions really emerge more strongly, lots of despair, meaninglessness, etc., high crime rates, all the things that Lisa was describing. And then, of course, that comes back and creates more trauma and stress for everybody. It's a vicious cycle. And we're seeing this. Not only here in the US, but certainly around the world. And so we really have to figure out what we can do about this. Most public health and mental health and disaster preparedness, community resilience programs, and climate programs have not addressed these issues. That's why it's so important, and the American Public Health Association needs to be congratulated for highlighting this issue and making it important, because this is a critical issue. Because left unaddressed, these impacts are going to undermine the health and safety and well-being of individuals and families and communities all across the US. And just as importantly, because fearful people tend to retreat into a self-protective survival mode, it's also that leaves them very uninterested in external issues like reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Unless we get a handle on these issues, our ability to motivate the public to reduce the climate crisis to manageable levels is going to be diminished also. So it's not just a public health issue, it's not just a mental health issue, it's also an environmental issue in that it really threatens our ability to deal with this really critical problem. And it's really important to realize that mental health and psychosocial, spiritual, and humanitarian crisis are often closely connected. That the UN Interagency Standing Committee declared that almost 10 years ago, that the traumas and stresses produced by climate change create interlinked problems for individuals, families, groups, neighborhoods, and entire societies. And the reason is because they erode critical personal and social protective systems. They amplify pre-existing mental health, social justice, and inequity problems, and they generate many new surprising problems as well. So we need a whole new way of thinking to respond to a 1.5 degrees Celsius or higher, more than likely much higher, temperature rise. One reason for that is, as important as they are, and it's going to be vital to improve our disaster management programs, especially our disaster mental health and resiliency programs. They're vital. We need to improve them. They're going to be increasingly overwhelmed as temperatures rise. Most are already pretty fragile, as many of you know, because you're probably involved with those. And also, they only deal with, most of them deal with short-term issues. They're trying to stabilize people during and after a disaster, which is, again, vital, but not enough because they don't help people deal with those ongoing chronic toxic stresses generated by climate change. That is to say, unless we make a focus on prevention. Most of the concepts of vulnerability that we focus on today are likely to be increasingly inadequate because every person and every group is actually going to be at risk as climate change plays out and worsens, yet not any person, not everyone in every group will be at risk. So we really have to begin to rethink what we mean by vulnerability. In fact, in some of the work we've done around the country, what we find is many of the people deemed vulnerable are more psychologically and socially resilient than those that are not deemed vulnerable. And it's the folks that have not been deemed vulnerable that prey on those that have less socioeconomic status, et cetera, in the midst of a disaster. They might need the skills more than the groups that we now deem vulnerable. And our concepts of resilience are likely to end up being inadequate also as temperatures rise by 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. First of all, it's going to be impossible to bounce back to pre-conditions. It's just not, we're not going to do that. And in fact, many people don't want to bounce back to pre-crisis conditions. I'm sure most of you, because you're all in the public health arena, know that up to 49% of children in many states experience adverse childhood experiences. Depends on what state you are and what those issues are. And that means they might experience physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, might live with somebody who's an alcoholic or a drug addict or in prison. And children who experience ACEs, as it's called, often have the brain development depressed. It's slowed because they contract, just like groups do, to protect themselves. That's why you see so many adolescents who have experienced ACEs who make bad decisions. And when they become adults, children who have experienced ACEs have much higher rates of mental health problems and physical health problems. Is that what we want to help people bounce back to? I don't think so. They don't want to. Most traumatized and stressed people want to increase their well-being, their sense of well-being, way above, well above where they previously were. And even the American Psychological Association here, and by the way, I want to thank them for allowing us to use the facility here. I don't see him here, but I also want to thank Sean, who helps run this facility, for all his help all the time. APA defines resilience as bouncing back. I don't think that's relevant, or not very helpful, put it that way, when we think about what's coming down the road from a climate change perspective. And also, do we want to bounce back to the socioeconomic patterns that we're now using that are tremendously high material resource and energy use and emissions? I don't think so. And in fact, many of our climate adaptation programs, and my organization was one of the early organizations in the US engaged in adaptation, that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to maintain the status quo so we can bounce back to where we were after a big storm, et cetera. Is that really what we want? I don't think so. It's not really going to help. Most people want to experience a sense of well-being without harming the climate and the biosphere. So we need to rethink what we're doing, and that means that traditional disaster preparedness programs, while extremely important, are also not likely to be all that sufficient. So this is from Rand, Anita Chandra's work and others. I think this is a great description of the difference between preparedness and resilience as we're looking at it. Preparedness is sort of plan-based, resilience is relationship-based. We're going to get into that in a second. It's mostly dominated by government agencies. When you're talking about resilience, it requires everybody to be involved. It's disaster-centered versus long-term, ongoing. It's rather than focusing on risks and vulnerability, it's focused on strengths. Resiliency is. Therefore, it's not narrowly defined, it's broadly defined. And it really has a different perspective. So prevention is the only solution. When we think about a 1.5 degree and more likely 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise that's coming down the pike, and maybe even a lot more, prevention is the only solution, and we know it works. It works with driving, drunk driving, and out with tobacco and other sorts of things. We know it works. Preventative, personal, and psychosocial spiritual resilience building initiatives are urgently needed in every community. And we want to enhance the capacity of individuals and groups to constructively respond rather than automatically react to traumas and toxic stresses with fear-based fight, flight, or freeze reactions when they are not needed. Sometimes they're needed. So we want to help people distinguish that, and at the same time, help people learn how to use adversities of all types as transformational catalysts to learn, grow, and increase their own well-being, their social, and their ecological well-being. In psychology, it's called post-traumatic growth. So can we couple the work we've been doing with helping people bounce back with post-traumatic growth? That's really what we're talking about. How do we use the climate crisis as actually an opportunity, as a stimulus, to get us focused on other ways to live, to think, to act, to treat each other that really increases well-being. And prevention is everyone's job. This is really critical. It's not just the public health agencies, but we can lead. We can lead these efforts. It involves healthcare, education, faith-based organizations, senior programs, all the racial and social justice and equity groups, all the way down, public agencies, etc. And the more effective community-based programs we've seen around the country have many or all of these kinds of interests involved. So think about how do we expand our efforts, and it really requires that we expand the way we think about these issues. That this is relatively new for the public health community as a whole, dealing with the traumas and toxic stresses of climate change, but it's consistent with and advances the traditional focus of public health on health, wellness, and preparedness. That's really consistent. And it's also extremely new for climate mitigation and adaptation programs. I've talked to groups all over the country who are focused on this, and oh no, that's not how we're focused on greenhouse gas emissions. But in fact, this is all coupled, number one. And number two, building personal and psychosocial spiritual resilience can be intermixed, can be interlinked with the work they do on mitigation and adaptation. It's going to help climate activists and their staff, and it's also critical for success. We're not going to succeed unless we deal with these issues. Okay, there's 3 pillars, and I will dive into that and spend the rest of the afternoon on this. And this comes out of extensive research and our practical experience working across the country and internationally, the ITRC, on these issues. There's 3 pillars of personal and psychosocial spiritual resilience. First is a trauma-informed and skilled citizenry, which means that everyone understands or widespread knowledge of the psychobiology of trauma and toxic stress. People know, not in the sophisticated language, they probably never use the term psychobiology of trauma and stress. How does trauma and stress affect me? And how might it affect others who I'm near? And then every adult and youth has the opportunity to learn and practice what we call presencing skills. We're going to do a few in a second. You did one a second ago, the resourcing. That was a very simple skill, as well as purposing skills. So we really want to help the citizenry become trauma-informed and skilled. But it requires more than that. It also requires robust human relationships to do this. So what we mean by that is we want every individual, every group to develop robust bonding, bridging, and linking social support networks. Bonding means we want to help everyone develop the network of 3 or 4 people, 2 to 3, that really can rely on to give them support, unconditional support in the middle of stress and trauma. Bridging is the connection between your small social support network and another group's small social support network. And the linking is between your two, the bonding and bridging, and some external agency or organization that might be able to provide resources. It might be a government organization. It might be the Red Cross. It might be St. Vincent de Paul Society, as an example. But secondarily, it's the development of social narratives that promote, in the community, promote health, safety, equitable and just conditions. And third, it requires strong links and communications among the diverse organizations, so they're always talking, so that linking social support network really comes in strongly. And then at the same time, it requires supportive organizations and communities. So that means that nonprofit, public, private organizations know when they're becoming trauma organized and know how to make the shift to a trauma-informed, resilience-enhancing organization. So, because the organizations people work with or associate with have a tremendous influence on an individual's capacity to remain calm and resilient when they're under stress. It also requires good access to physical and mental health and emergency preparedness services, and sufficient job and financial opportunities and healthy public spaces for interaction. So let's dive into those using what we call the transformational resilience and using what we call the resilient growth model. This is the model I developed with about 12 other trauma treatment resiliency building specialists a couple of years back to really help frame what we're going to do. You don't have to use this term, you don't have to use the model, but it just provides one way of thinking about it. And the resilient growth model is framed around the knowledge that humans are pushed by those psychobiological drives, that neurochemicals being released into our bloodstream that put us into a position of trying to fight back, flee, or when it's overwhelming, we end up freezing. But we're also pulled by a desire for our lives to have meaning and purpose. Both of those are present in humans. And what we're trying to do is create what you could call a resilient mindset. And so the first part of a resilient mindset is people know, I understand how trauma and stress can affect my mind and body. So I'm trauma informed. I understand that. Again, in their own words, in age and culturally appropriate terms. And by the way, I think the PowerPoints for this presentation, I think Lisa's also, will be posted, I was told, on the APHA website. So you'll be able to get them. So that's one. The second is I have a set of skills, a social support network, and other resources I can count on, I can use in the middle of trauma and toxic stress to calm myself and find new meaning, direction, and hope. And the third is, so that's, I can take care of myself. The third is I have skills and resources I can use to help others in the natural environment. That's a resilient mindset. What if every adult and youth in the US started to learn and develop a resilient mindset? What if this happened in K through 12? And then for professional development in the college system and everywhere else, we're teaching people these kinds of focuses. What would the impacts be? So the first part of the resilient growth model is focused on what we call presencing skills, focused on calming our emotions and thoughts. The first step is to ground and center yourself by stabilizing your nervous system. The second is to remember that you've got skills, you've got resources, and you've got a social support network you can use to help with this. And the third then is to also remember to look at your thinking and see if it's your thinking that's causing this stress. Am I catastrophizing? Am I blaming someone else, etc.? And to look at that non-judgmentally with self-compassion. And by the way, we came up with the term resilient growth working with this team over about, I guess it was almost 2 years. And it took us about 6 months to decide, if anybody's done this together, you know, 1,600 emails back and forth on the word growth. But what this means is that every letter in the word growth stands for another step in the process. It was one of those funny processes. The second component, though, is just as important. So most of the time when we think about therapy or treatment, we're mostly helping stabilize people through what we call presencing. You can call it whatever you want. But that's when one event might happen and then you've got calm period, a stable period. What if adversity continues? We need something else. So purposing is really critical to climate change because we need to be able to find meaning, direction, and hope even in the midst of ongoing adversity. So the first is to look at an adversity and try to find ways to find meaning and learn about ourselves from it, learn about the world from it. Then we want to help people tap into the values they want to live by in the midst of adversity. And then finally, we want to help people harvest hope for new possibilities by making choices that increase their well-being and the well-being of others. So let's dive into some of these skills and just give you a flavor of it. The first is presencing. Let's just go in that a second. You want to help people, again, all adults and youth, learn how toxic stress and adversity affects their body, minds, and emotions, and then learn simple, self-administered skills to help them stabilize their nervous system. But at the same time, we want to help people learn self-administered skills to create some psychological flexibility, as we call it. Remember, it's our mind racing that often keeps us dysregulated. So first we want to go into the body, but we also want to help sort of just give ourselves some space from the thoughts going through our minds that keep us dysregulated. And what we've found when we've run training workshops all over the country, and we've done them in the UK and elsewhere, that people always say that the knowledge that I can begin to manage my emotions and thoughts in almost any situation gives me a great deal of confidence and peace. What if we began to make that a priority in our country? So what we're trying to do in presencing skills is activate the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is part of the two parts of the autonomic nervous system. It acts like a gas pedal. It's what the amygdala triggers when it senses a threat to try to provide that burst of energy to protect ourselves. The parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite. It's the brake pedal of the body. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to activate it. It promotes that rest and digest response and calms the sympathetic nervous system. So that's what we're trying to do. So let's try a few, just one or two simple skills. Well, first, before I do that. So the first step is, again, go back and start teaching everyone the psychobiology of trauma and toxic stress. Help people find out, kids and adults, and you can get on the web, there's lots of programs out there that do this. Let's really expand those to help people learn, oh yeah, that's a natural reaction. You want to normalize their reaction, first of all, to trauma and stress. When they begin to get angry, when they begin to get frightened, help people realize that's a natural reaction going on in your body, and you have the capacity to regulate it. With these other components. So let's help people understand that. Let me just go back and say, there's a number of organizations focused on this, but let's create a trauma-informed nation. What if we make it a priority that everyone in our society learns about how trauma and toxic stress can affect their mind and body? Then we can teach all sorts of different skills, body-based, breath-based, awareness-based, culturally based, and combo skills to help people learn and continually practice skills to regulate and stabilize their nervous system. So let's try another one, if you're willing. Again, you don't have to do this, but I'd just like to invite you, if you're willing, just to put your attention to parts of your body that are being supported by something very firm and strong. It might be your feet now on the floor. Might be your back leaning against a chair. Maybe it's your thighs sitting on the chair. Put your attention into your body, and just sense where your body is being supported by something firm. And just try to keep your attention there for a second. And as you do that, just try to notice the physical sensations that might be tingling, might be warmth, whatever's there. And let yourself sink into whatever it is that's providing support for your body. You might find yourself being focused on unpleasant sensations, maybe pain or tension or heat. And if so, see if you can find a place in your body that's being supported by something solid that feels pleasant or neutral. Might be a pleasant warmth, pleasant tingling. Try to focus on pleasant sensations where you're being supported by something solid. And then just while you're doing that, notice your breathing, notice your heart rate, just see if there's any changes. Without trying to change anything, just notice what's happening in your body, if anything. And then when you're ready, just come back to the room. Anybody like to share what that was like? Anybody have any reactions to, this was a skill called grounding, again, one by Elaine Miller-Karras and the Trauma Resource Institute. Anybody have any reaction to that? Any thoughts they'd like to share? Lisa?
Well, I was going to say that as I was sort of in a meditative state, that I increasingly began to realize how I wasn't so comfortable and wanted instead to adjust my body in a way that seemed stabler and more consistent with the feelings that I was hoping to achieve. So it brought greater insight into what I was feeling, and it gave me a more peaceful sense, not needing to repress any abnormal positions that might not have nicely supported me. So it brought me to a nicer and sweeter, so to speak, place.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's a very, usually, it's not for everybody, but that's often a common reaction, partly because you're, again, we're calling these presencing skills. What does that mean? We're no longer thinking about what we should have done this morning or something we have to do tomorrow or all the things we forgot to do. We're in the present moment. And that helps us come back and start to activates the parasympathetic nervous system and sort of calms the sympathetic nervous system, which is what I think you were describing. I just wanted to give you a sense of another very simple skill that anyone can learn, that we can be teaching. The public health community can be teaching to everyone across the country. And you can go deeper. We did this very quickly. You teach this grounding skill, and you can teach, it goes further in terms of people developing roots, etc. But there's tracking, grounding, and resourcing that are body-based skills, and there's actually others. There's breath-based skills, there's awareness-based skills, music and dance and eating are culturally based skills that are helpful for folks to do that. So that's the first step. Let's teach people how to stabilize their nervous system. But then also, while they're doing that, help people realize that, hey, wait a second, you've got some skills for dealing with these kind of issues. Most of us forget it in the midst of trauma and stress. We're all ramped up. And we've got resources and a social support network we can count on. So I'd like to do a little exercise if you're willing. We'll do this very quickly, but if you can take out a piece of paper, and if you don't have one, you can use the back of the agenda. And just put your name in the middle of the piece of paper. We're going to draw a number of circles around your name as you can see it here. And in that first circle, just put down 1 or 2 skills that you personally have to help yourself stay calm and feel peaceful in the midst of adversity. Maybe you can get good exercise. Maybe you can eat well. Maybe you're good at reaching out to other people. Maybe you go watch funny movies. Each person's different. Just name 1 or 2 things you can do that you know that you can use when you are stressed, and you can help yourself stay calmer and feel more peace then. Just real quickly, 1 or 2. And then draw another circle around yourself. Again, we're doing this very quickly normally, and if we're doing this in a workshop form, kids would be different than adults, but we'll take a lot more time on this. But then write down your internal resources that you have to deal with trauma and toxic stress. And what I mean by that is those resources I talked about initially that you can bring to mind to help you stay calm and feel a sense of peace. So one is your own skills. The first, now, what resources? Again, the image of holding my cat, holding, my now passed away 17-year-old pound cat, Beluga, is a sample resource. And we're going to keep moving here. Now write down the people involved with your bonding social support network. Who are the 2, 3, 4, most of us it's just 2 or 3, sometimes it's 0, but people who you can rely on to give you unqualified empathy and support no matter what's going on. Do you have the people that you truly bond with? It might be your spouse, might be your parent, could be a friend. Usually it's family or close friends. Who are the 1 or 2 or 3 people that you can truly rely on? And if we took more time with this, you would drill down, and often what happens is people first identify 4 or 5 people and they realize, no, they're really not, I really can't completely rely on them. Usually we just have 1 or 2, maybe 3 at the most. Now write down, go outside one more time, your bridging social support network. What other small social support networks is your group, your bonding group, connected to? Might be one down the block. And the reason this is important, because that's often where you're going to get information about what's going on, or extra help. So my Uncle Fred and my good best friend Jimmy, actually they're pretty connected to the one up the block, and we occasionally have dinner together, and I hear about what's going on in their lives. That's our bonding social support network. Or bridging, excuse me. And often what happens is we go out, people's social support networks get a little bit weaker. One more, let's go out and say, what is your linking social support network? How does your bonding and bridging, what connections to external resources in your community do you have? Are you connected to a government agency in some way, or a nonprofit in some way? Where I live in Eugene, Oregon, it's the YMCA that I'm very connected with, and my social support network connected with that. I've been playing basketball there for 35 years, and I know if I go down there, we're old, slow, bad basketball players now, most of us in our mid-60s, but I'll see my friends, I can get help, They have programs, et cetera. So that's the linking social support networks. And then finally, write down your external resources. These are actual physical things you can rely on when you're traumatized or stressed. It might be you have a preparedness kit at home with extra food or water, or to help you deal with trauma. So maybe it's just a room in your house where you can go and you can sit, or it's your garden where you can go out to and walk around outside. What external resources do you have that can help you deal with trauma and toxic stress? Now, we did this fairly quickly. Normally, we would take a good hour, 45 minutes in a workshop to do this kind of exercise, but I wanted you to get a sense of how you can help people. First of all, this is their circle. This is your circle of support. This is truly, especially if you fleshed it out, to really identify this is where the support is. So take especially after the workshop here, take a look at this. In fact, is there some gaps in it? Are there some limitations? Are there some weaknesses, areas you'd like to strengthen? And really try to focus on how you can do that. And in the public health arena, or if you're an educator, or in any other field in all these groups that we talked about that should be involved with prevention, help people strengthen those circles of support. Help people learn, for example, how to be more assertive or more communicative in order to meet more friends, to develop a better bonding social support network. But let's help people understand where they're at. So that's just one example. We're going to keep going. And then finally, we want to help people, after we help them remember that they have that support, that they can reach out to those, they can use those skills, they can use those resources and their social support network to actually also help them make sure they look at and you can do this with kids or adults, look at the way they're thinking. This is from Glenn Gerard, Training International, has been a core member of ours, and this is classic cognitive work, cognitive therapy work turned into a simple system. We're all aware of activating events, and we're also often aware of the consequences of that, our emotions, and what we're not often very aware of is that it is our beliefs about those events, not the event itself, that's usually causing those consequences, those emotions for us. And so what you want to do is help people look at these kind of thinking distortions, as we call it, and say, are you getting trapped in that? Are you overgeneralizing, or are you catastrophizing? Are you blaming others? And it's a process that also helps. Oh yeah, I guess I am. Oh, maybe it isn't quite as bad as I thought right now. So one of the things that we encourage everyone to do is to help every adult and child develop their own what we call presencing safety plan. What if every adult and child in the U.S. had this, where here they write down symptoms they look for when they find themselves distressed. It might be rapid breathing or sweating too much or those headaches or whatever it might be. Then you write down, what am I going to do? What skills am I going to use to stabilize my nervous system and calm my mind and body and stress? So you have it there. We've done this in workshops all over the country, and we find that people really appreciate it. And we ask them to make a small copy and put it in your wallet, put it on your desk, post it on your mirror in your bathroom, whatever. So we're always remembering how to do that. But also remember that we're all pulled by meaning and purpose as well, not just pushed by those psychobiological drives. And so we're going to go into purposing very quickly here. And that's to really learn skills to intensify the pull of wanting our life to have meaning and purpose. Again, presencing is necessary, but it doesn't doesn't guarantee a principled, meaningful life in the midst of ongoing stresses. And so purposing is really about developing that kind of meaning and direction and hope in life. And it really is about making values-based choices that enhance your own well-being, but also the well-being of others. So let's dive into the first couple very quickly. The first step is to try to learn from adversity. You watch for insight and meaning in an adversity. And this is what this is really about. We all have a certain level of functioning, and we go along with that functioning, and then some adverse event hits us. And we become dysregulated. This is the nature of life. Happens to all of us. We all get knocked back off our where we'd like to be at some point in time. Most of us recover. We call that resilience, bouncing back, etc. But some people are actually able to use that adverse event to grow, to learn and grow and increase their well-being. Again, it's called, one way it's called is post-traumatic growth, using adversity as a catalyst to increase their well-being and find new meaning, direction, and hope in life. And what we find is that, and the research is pretty clear about, is self-transcendence, so to speak, is often key. And what this means is the people who find the most hope and new meaning in life end up focusing on other people, rising above their own personal interests to help others or nature, the environment, as a way to help themselves. They're the ones that experience the most growth and the most new meaning and purpose in life through adversity. And that's really important because it helps us frame what we're going to focus on in terms of helping people respond effectively. What if we help everyone learn how to use climate adversities and all types of other adversities as catalysts to learn and grow and increase their well-being? What would the results be, the impacts be? And it's really, if there's anything that's true about climate change, if there's a silver lining in it at all, it's that adversity can be, and often is, our greatest impetus for personal and collective growth. So let's use it that way. Let's not try to just bounce back to where we were before. Let's use this as a learning experience. People who experience post-traumatic growth, the research shows they find really profound changes in the way they look at the world, their relationships, their own personal health and well-being, leading to better mental health, improved positivity, improved physical health, and a shift from what I call me to we, focusing on others as much as just myself. And this is lots of research out on that. And by the way, the ITRC has put together a library on the research that this model comes out of. It's on our website. Please look for it. So, you know, one thing you could do is just use an exercise to ask people to identify one or two times when they used adversity to learn and grow and increase their well-being. We've all done that. Think yourself about that, where you probably weren't conscious of it or didn't think of it that way, but when you used an adversity to learn and grow and increase your well-being. Just an example, did you rededicate yourself to a goal or a mission after a setback, or develop new priorities in life, or eat better and get more exercise after you got ill or somebody in your family got ill? Or identified new strengths in the middle of a problem you had or a hardship, or found more desire to help others because somebody helped you in the middle of a hardship. We've all done this. So one step is just to help people know they already know how to do it. But it's a matter of making it conscious and then really helping them service that. And so you can have people describe a stressful event, how they reacted, describe how that reaction affected them, other people in the environment, and then ask people to look at these questions. What could you have learned about yourself in the midst of this, rather than reacting in the same way? How could you have increased the well-being of others, or even the environment in this, and how can you find new direction in life? And one other thing that we're not going to dive into here, but grieving can be very important in this process. That when we're learning and growing through adversity, we're also usually having to give up something important. That's what we feel. So you got to help people learn how to grieve. And we have to normalize the grieving process, that it's normal, it's okay, it's good, and help people learn age and culturally appropriate ways to do that. Then you want to help people tap into the values they want to live by in the midst of adversity. Values refer to actions, not ideals or morals or goals. Values are about how you act during your life, not what you accomplish. And so what we do in our workshops is we have adults and youth. We do it different ways with youth. Just try to identify their top 3 values. We offer a chart like this, and we ask them to go through and circle it. What are the top 3 values that you want to live your life by? And then we asked them to go back to the distressing event we just talked about and say, what if you had applied those 3 values in the midst of that event? Would it have led to a different response? So help people really learn this. And also use humor and have gratitude through all this. It's really critical to laugh at have the capacity to laugh at ourselves, laugh at the human condition. This even as crazy as it sounds, think about what humans have done from climate perspective. I mean, you got to laugh at, I mean, what kind of species are we that would do that? I mean, we do have to have some sort of humor about that. And then finally, we want to help people harvest hope by really making some hard choices to increase their own well-being, the well-being of others and the environment. And the best way, again, as I said, is to help people, encourage them to take concrete actions with others to help others or nature. And it activates, as Lisa was talking about, the release of oxytocin in our bodies, which makes us more empathetic and altruistic. So we always want to remember the oxytocin virtuous cycle. The more that we can get people out engaged with others, and social media does not do it, it's got to be personal interactions with others, the more we'll release oxytocin, the more empathetic people become, the more interested they are, therefore, in doing something altruistic. That develops more trust, which releases more oxytocin. And this is pretty well researched, so let's use it. And when people do engage with others, help others, they become more honest and loving and kind, and you can see all the benefits, and it leads to much better hope and positivity, etc. And you can, a simple exercise is just ask yourself, when was the last time you opened a door for someone that didn't expect it, or did something for somebody that wasn't expecting it and you didn't feel an obligation to do it? How did you feel? It's a very simple exercise, and you can go from there. And what you really want to do is then ask people to develop a vision of where they want to go in helping others or the environment, a strategy for how to get there, and how to overcome some obstacles when that happens. And I think public health practitioners can use climate adversities to really help people think about revival, to find new ways to live that are not, we may not fully understand yet, but they're more sustainable, equitable, and just. And then help everyone develop a purposing action plan. How are they going to help others, the natural environment, and themselves in the midst of adversity? And we do this, and again, just like the Presencing Safety Plan, it's very powerful. So again, those are the 3, I've gone through the 3 pillars of building human resilience. I'm now going to just talk about the organizational community component. Again, we want to help people, organizations, communities shift from trauma organized to trauma informed. The trauma organized organizations and communities really allow the trauma and stress reactions to destabilize their thought processes, their emotions and foundations, and leading to really a sense of physical, psychological, and moral lack of moral safety. But when organizations adopt principles and practices and policies that promote equitable, safe, and just norms and practices, they actually can make a shift to a trauma-informed, resilience-enhancing organization. If you've looked at the work of Sandy Bloom and many others involved in the trauma-informed organization field, you'll find tools to do this. I don't want to go into it right now, but it's really critical. So here I want to close by just talking about how do we get this kind of work going. First, I suggest organizing resilience leadership councils in every organization and community across the country. We already have these in many ways, but they're often focused just on a more narrow issue. But these are respected community leaders from all those different sectors that I listed that can come together to try to lead the effort in a community or in an organization to build human resilience. And the first step that they can take is to complete resilience assessments. We want to know the current level of resilience in our community, and I'll explain that in a second, and the types of human resilience building programs, education and training programs the kind of skills they teach, and which populations do not have access to those programs and or don't have age or culturally appropriate skills being offered. We really want to understand that. And we also want to understand what are the dominant social narratives in our community. What are people hearing? And how does that affect how they think and how they act? And then that leadership council, and this can be anywhere between 6 to 20 people. We're organizing one in Eugene, Oregon now for what we call the Building a Resilient Lane County. We'll have about 18 people on it that involve the faith community, the mental health community, behavioral health, the police and others. Very diverse. Again, you want to help either expand the existing resiliency building programs that you knew were there, or launch new ones, so every adult and youth can learn the psychobiology of trauma and toxic stress, create trauma-informed organizations and communities, help everyone learn some version of those presencing and purposing skills in their own terms, whatever they want to call them, that we just talked about. And you want to help all organizational leaders and community leaders, including elected officials. I think it would be very helpful now to have that happen. Learn what it means for their group to be trauma organized, what the impacts are, and how to shift to a trauma-informed, resilience-enhancing group. And then you also want to help those respected community leaders, it might be a Resilience Leadership Council, jointly promote social narratives that support safe, equitable, just, and healthy behaviors and norms. And really what we're saying is resilience education and skills building should become as common now as learning to read and write. Let's launch a national movement to kick this off. There are a number of benefits if we really help people learn how to regulate and calm the nervous system when they're distressed. We'll see less drug and alcohol use, less depression and other kinds of mental health problems, and less physical health problems. And when we combine that with building the social capital, those social support networks, et cetera, and the engagement of respected senior leaders in a community organization to promote social narratives that we talked about, you're going to find more trusting relationships, reduced crime rates, reduced aggression and interpersonal violence. Crime rates again, this research comes out of when leaders in a community come out and talk about what's appropriate behavior and what's not. And talk to the folks that might be engaged in those kind of activities, the behavior starts to change. And we'd see less ACEs, less childhood experiences. And when you combine that with the post-traumatic growth work, with teaching people how to use adversity as a transformational catalyst to learn, grow, and increase their sense of well-being, we'll get people become more aware of their context. They not only become more self-aware, aware of the context around them, and therefore more support for social and health equity, and a whole lot less people contracting into a self-protective survival mode, meaning more support for actions like reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the model that we wanted to share and the message we wanted to give out, which is, again, let's launch a national initiative in communities and in organizations around the country to begin to build personal and psychosocial spiritual resilience. We do not need to use the model we just suggested, but we do need to think about both helping people regulate their nervous system, learn how to do that when they're distressed, and then second, learn how they want to live in the midst of ongoing adversity without harming themselves, without harming others, and without harming the natural environment, and in fact, increasing their well-being. The more we can engage people in helping others, the more that's going to be reinforced, and we're going to actually end up with much better off. So I'm going to stop there and open it up to, and Lisa will come back up here, to some questions before we end. And I know there's some other people on the line that might have, that've been watching, that might have some questions also. So questions, thoughts? How many of you, let me ask a few questions of you to get it going. How many of you have seen programs like this? It might be bits and pieces. And can you share anything about those that you've seen? How can you think about how to expand those or whatever? Right behind you. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Rachel Call from Department of Health and Human Services. We've certainly been looking at our state and local partners, particularly in the healthcare sector, healthcare coalitions, et cetera, trying to determine programs that have promising practices for building resilience. But as I was listening to you talk, I was actually thinking a little bit more further back when I started doing a lot of trauma work after 9/11, and we were really relying on post-traumatic growth and Calhoun and those folks, because what we had been doing up to that wasn't working with the populations we were serving. So I was just thinking about it from more of translating that solution-focused post-traumatic growth kind of model to communities and how we could maybe promulgate that. So that's kind of where my head was going with this.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And let me just say again, so one approach is to wait until after the 9/11 or whatever to try to implement those. It's another, what if we tried to start now with prevention program to give people these skills before we have that kind of situation? And we know how long it takes for prevention to begin to work. It takes a long time to get the programs together, to really have them become saturated, really get out there. So we got to start now, not in 10 years, but the results might be, first of all, when people are dysregulated or traumatized, they are much more easily or readily able to come back to pre-exist, to stabilize themselves if they've already had some of the training. So first, you can prevent a lot of those impacts. Second, when they do happen, it's easier for folks to come back. And third, they might actually end up using it as a positive experience to increase their well-being. Thank you. Other questions? Sir.
Hello, we have a question from one of our online participants, Richard Cool. He asks, with everyone becoming calm and regulated, where do communities put the righteous anger that may be needed to mobilize towards the social and political changes that are needed?
Great, good question. I'll take a first shot and then Lisa can talk about it. We're not saying that everybody is just sort of zoned out calmly. We're saying that what you're trying to do, I didn't show the slide, but Elaine Miller-Karras has developed this too. We all have a resilient growth zone, so to speak, that's really determined by our nervous system. And we bounce up and down in that resilient growth zone. And in there, we're able to make wise and skillful decisions. So we're able to take out our anger in an appropriate, effective way. When we are bounced outside of that resilient growth zone, we're stuck in the high zone and we're just furious or stuck in a low zone and depressed. That's when we're going to make bad decisions about how to respond and often make things worse. So this is about speaking truth to power, as an example, but doing it in a way where we're stabilized so we can do it effectively, thoughtfully, and as aggressively as we can, but not in a way that actually backfires. You want to add anything?
Well, yes. Thank you. I think Bob said it mostly. Obviously, we are outraged and we are angry, but we can be consumed by it. I'm just saying it in a different way. And some of the downside of that is that rather than being able to engage others, especially people who might not agree with us, we push them away. So that anger really has to be managed, used really as a vehicle for the expression of our values, not as a defining state. So we embrace it, but we use it very pragmatically is how I would comment.
So these people who have adversity in their life, and when you show the scale and they take that and they catapult and they become successful and they do these things for others, is that a genetic aspect? Is that a learned? And if it is genetic, can we learn to do that, to take an adversity and to really turn it into a positive and to grow from it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. What stimulates? What is this something unique that I think the research is unclear about all that. That I don't think it is genetic per se. I don't think that some people are able and some people not because of the genetic makeup. It's often their social support network. whether they have people who will support that or not, or will support whatever they do or not, and it's their skills they have, and and let me also say that it doesn't mean the pain goes away. In post-traumatic growth, I used to work in this field quite a bit, that actually the pain never leaves. And in fact, it's always there, and that's what stimulates the growth. We're never going to forget that humans have dysregulated the climate. That's going to be with us for 500 years or more. So just an example, but we can keep that in mind with every behavior we do and every time we do something. So it's that they use it and they look at it, they hold the pain in a different way. And that's what we can help people learn about. Some, even after they learn about it, won't be able to do it, but a whole lot will. If we actually learn about it ourselves and run train-the-trainer programs and train public health workers across the country to begin to do this kind of work. Thank you.
And I'll just add, as you say, that this is what sustains behavioral change versus just an episodic good choice. That post-traumatic growth and the recognition of the pain is what's responsible for sustained behavioral change.
And people will say, often who experience this, that I never would wish this on anyone, but actually it did end up leading to some positive things for me. That's sort of how you often hear them frame it. I wish it didn't happen to me, but it ended up, et cetera.
The whole piece whole piece about things being episodic and then shifting our mind. As you said that, maybe climate change we ought to think about in terms of another phenomenon that's taken hundreds of years for us to deal with, slavery in this country. To the extent that we knew throughout the period that we were doing it, it was wrong. All our founding fathers owned slaves, not all of them, but many of them. Yet they described this concept of freedom and liberation. So maybe side by side we can carry on strange, less than equal thoughts, but there is certainly ways in which we can grow from that. I don't know if I'm connecting too many disparate thoughts, but it doesn't strike me that from the examples you gave up, that we're dealing with anything that's just a one-time trauma. It's again and again and again.
Right.
So how do we grow when we know we've been traumatized?
Right. Thank you.
Every day.
Thank you. So the question is, there's a number of traumas. That's what I started off with. We're all experiencing more and more trauma and stress all the time. How do we learn and grow in the middle of that? I think, again, and can we use that to learn about other situations where we're doing the same thing now, like we have done in slavery and in some ways still doing it with racism, et cetera. First of all, let me say that none of the skills, tools, frameworks that I provided were developed for climate change. Right? They were developed for adverse childhood experiences and other kinds of traumas and stresses. We just took that and say, what would help with this particular set of issues? So if we, in fact, launch a national movement to build personal and psychosocial resilience, we're going to help people deal with a number of different traumas and stresses. It will help with ACEs, it will help with community violence, it will help with a lot of things, and it will help people become more aware of themselves. We see that, we have research on the effectiveness of these programs. More awareness of self and more awareness of our context, that leads many people or some people to understand, oh, I'm abusing others. My inherent racism or whatever it might be is not a good thing. So I think it can have those kinds of effects. It takes time, it has to be dose-based, we have to work at it, but I think it will have multiple effects, not just preparing for climate change. Please, you say. And I don't know if I answered your question. So, thank you. Time for one or two more.
And this kind of goes along with what you were saying about scaling this on a national level, but Sarah Finier Robinson had a question for you saying, have you thought of partnering with the appropriate national coalitions in order to scale this national movement for transformational resilience? For instance, the 100 Resilient Cities organized by the Rockefeller Foundation, or Mike Bloomberg's new coalition of cities, states, and businesses and others, which was formed immediately after President Trump's announcement to withdraw from the Paris Agreement.
Right. Well, thank you for that question. Yes, we have thought about and tried to partner with as many organizations as we could, like the American Public Health Association and a number of others. We welcome that. We were part of one of the 100% community programs. What we find is that often they're pretty locked in to the external physical changes and very hard to get them to their attention on these issues. We hope that over time that'll expand. But we have not been successful in doing that yet to any great extent. Again, I'm not suggesting that those external physical focuses aren't important. They are. The less impacts we have, physical, the less the trauma and stress. But when you know that, when you think about climate temperatures rising to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, there is going to be a lot of impacts. Let me just, my organization was one of the first involved with adaptation work around the country. We were funded by Rockefeller and Ford and Kresge Foundation. And in doing all that work around the world, in fact, we ended up organizing something called the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, ASAP. We thought that was cute. The first professional organization for people in the field. And what I realized through that work, and which is why I got into, started the ITRC about 4.5 years ago, was that we again were exclusively focused on those external physical factors, a little bit now, since that time, in the physical health factors. And I kept asking, well, what about people? How do we prepare people for these impacts? And it just wasn't there. And the reason is, one of the reasons is many of the people involved in that field are biologists or engineers or, trained in seeing the world in a certain way. Vitally important. We need to get the public health, the mental health, the behavioral health, all those folks involved with this also equally. In fact, the way I've said it is, we have to have our response to climate change has to be a triangle. Right now, it's a two-part focus: mitigation and adaptation, which is mostly physical, external stuff. We need to add the human component, and they have to have equal weight. And right now, the third component, which I think is the most important for the other two, is almost zero. Or very little. So yes, we'd love to partner with other groups, and let us know how.
And so we have a question from Christina Lammers, who asks, while this is certainly a prevention health promotion approach, it is usually difficult to sell it to officials specifically and to the public in general. Do you have any recommendations for how to frame this approach?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. So our experience is that, again, we've worked across the country in different communities. Start where the community's at. Often in some communities we don't ever even talk about climate change initially, but as we've learned in certain federal programs, you can talk about extreme weather events. Would you like to be more resilient? Or what happened the last time there was an extreme weather event? So sort of ground it in the experience of the people in the organization or the community, and then grow it and build it from there. Often there's a network. It often is the public health or mental health community or social service community in a community that have come together to work on specific issues, and just begin to work with them and ask them, who else would you like to have involved? What else might draw them into this kind of discussion or this focus? What other skills would people like to learn? And I hope I'm not going to speak out of school here. We'll see. But so there's a program. First of all, one of the better programs around the country is the MARC program, Mobilizing Action for Resilient Communities. It's run by funded by the Philadelphia, I think the Health Federation of Philadelphia. I can't remember how many programs they have, but they're doing many. They're all different. Many of them focused on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. But one is actually in my town, my state, Oregon, in Hood River, Oregon. It was initially called Creating Sanctuary in the Gorge. in Hood River. Now it's called Building Resilience in the Gorge, which is the Columbia River Gorge outside of Portland. And they started with the social service organizations because they had, and educational programs because they had high truancy rates, high dropout rates in schools, and some community violence. And now they're growing and expanding it because other people are seeing the benefits of it. So there are programs already doing this kind of work, and I encourage you to look at the models they've used and the different ways they've grown their programs.
My comment just for a second.
And that is, it's both a comment and a question. And that is that I have found, believe it or not, that my colleagues, not through the American Psychological Association, because years ago, 9 years ago, they already had made a statement, but it took us many, many years to finally get the American Psychiatric Association to pass a statement about climate change. So I have found that colleagues, curiously, sometimes are very resistant, and they can't visualize the psychological impacts of climate change. They'd rather think of it as some concrete problem that we can build something for to keep ourselves protected, not realizing, or on a sort of an unconscious level, that the psychological stuff permeates every boundary. So having said that, when we have reached out to community mental health centers, and especially Association for Community Mental Health, they have been more responsive when we talk about these things, and they'll say, geez, I hadn't thought of it that way. Have you considered at all, Bob, reaching out to community mental health centers?
We do, excuse me, all the time when we're involved with a community program. We try to reach out and see who's there. Yeah,
because there is the association also of community mental health.
Yeah, I think we might have reached out there. I don't know, but
might be a way to get in the back door because so often, as someone said, it's resisted.
Right. Well, I'm going to close up here, but I just want to say that we've been starting with a bottom-up approach, starting at the community level and working and expanding there. We have talked with a number of national organizations, but we need both. We need a middle-out approach. And I just want to first, again, thank the American Public Health Association for sponsoring this conference. I want to thank the APHA for declaring June Mental Wellness and Psychosocial Resilience Month. And I want to encourage all of you to think about how you can help launch or support or expand a personal and psychosocial resilience building initiative in your organization or in your community. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.